Give it up for the president of the Innovation Resource, Dr. Robert Tucker.
It's good to be with everybody. How we doing? Look at this group. And just happen to be in the world's most wonderful line of work, right? Sports, business. I mean, can it get any better than that? I think not. You are there. You're in the sweet spot. Well, I want to talk with you a little bit about navigating this morning, but you know, we should probably do a little check-in here. I want to ask you, how many of you took a shower this morning to start your day? And it's unanimous. And that's good because we're in kind of close quarters here, you know, and the day's going to be long. And how many of you got an idea in the shower this morning? Can I see your hands? Look at this, 25, 30% of the room. And that kind of squares with the demographics I received prior to this meeting. I knew this was a group of movers and shakers. I knew this was a group of people who take their ideas seriously. We're going to talk about how you get ideas and what you do with those ideas here this morning. We're going to talk about a big picture concept, right? Navigating the future. Are you seeing, and Abe mentioned it in his opening remarks there, the word navigate is everywhere today, right? Russian tech workers suddenly leaving their home country in the wake of the Ukrainian invasion to navigate a future they never expected. Whoa, that's intense. Or last year, HR directors navigating the great resignation when 41 million Americans said, hey, take this job and shove it, I'm out of here. You remember that one? 41 million Americans. I mean, even our pets are having to navigate these days, right? Now that we're no longer going to the office. I heard two dogs talking the other day. They won't leave us alone. They want to go for another walk. We just took one. So everybody's in on this navigating thing, and I want to ask you a question. How you doing with regard to navigation? And what are you learning? What are you experiencing with vis-a-vis navigation? Because look at all the ways in which you're having to, or getting to navigate these days, if you stop to think about it. I mean, not only in your career, when suddenly in this industry especially, the world is your oyster, and you can take your career any old which way you want because it's a seller's market for talent. You're navigating your family, keep them safe, right? During this tumultuous time, you're navigating as a citizen, as a concerned citizen in a country that's in a rather perilous time. You're navigating in your community and in your volunteer efforts and boards that you serve on, and so forth and so on. And so we need to look at how we're navigating here and maybe derive a few lessons out of that whole experience. I first came on to the power of innovation and navigating and setting your sails for where you want to go and where you want to end up in life way back in the Pleistocene era. Back in 1982, I was a lowly freelance writer living in Los Angeles, but living the dream. Let me tell you, I had an apartment about the size of a postage stamp with a Murphy bed. Hey, cool. And I would do stories on a lot of different topics, but I kind of gravitated toward thought leaders. Hey, maybe that's why I'm here. And studying them, going out and interviewing people like Jonas Salk and, my gosh, CEOs like Fred Smith of Federal Express. But I did a story on a man by the name of John Nesbitt. Now, does that, I'm going to ask for a little audience participation. Does that name ring a bell to anybody in this room? Raise your hand. Not a soul. Oh my gosh, I'm dating myself. Well, if you zoom back in time to 1982, John Nesbitt had the #1 best-selling book on the New York Times list for over a year, 14 million copies, and the name of the book was Megatrends. And it was about new directions in our lives. And so I said, well, I'm going to do a story on this guy. give me a chance, because I use journalism as a kind of calling card, as an excuse to hang out with the great man. And he was like doing 2 and 3 lectures a day sometimes at $40,000 a pop. I said, this is not a bad way to make a living. And but the thing that Nesbitt really imparted to me was not so much his trends, some of which came to pass, and others he was completely off. But it was the way that he taught that the best way to anticipate the future is to really pay attention to the underlying driving forces of change that are already happening kind of right now, right beneath our noses. And he said if you did that kind of work, basically, because that's what it is, that you would be able to make better decisions about your career, about where to go, where to work, how to position your company. In other words, how to get to the future first. Well, man, I took that in. I followed his advice, and I ended up following in his footsteps because I went out there on the so-called rubber chicken circuit and never looked back. And I don't have any regrets for that. And here we are, 30 some odd years later, and 3 million air miles, 54 countries, thousands of clients, thousands of opportunities to share ideas, and I'm most honored and privileged to try to be of service to you today to share a few ideas on this navigational theme. So let's, without further ado, let's just dive in. The first concept that I want to talk to you about is this notion of getting better at what we might call strategic foresight. There are so many new tools for this. And I think one of the big things that come out of this pandemic is the fact that we're vulnerable if we don't engage in some of this sort of thing. And you all are lucky because you have SBJ to apprise you of the trends. And yet, what I want to talk about is more broad than just sports trends, because those will also have a tendency, as we saw with the pandemic, of reaching out and biting us if we're not kind of on top of them. And so the big refrain that I hear as I travel around, and I'm sure you're hearing this too and seeing this too, is we didn't see it coming. Are you hearing that? Yeah. The grocery industry didn't see it coming, and Amazon jumps in their business, and all of a sudden $90 billion in market cap just kind of flies out the window. There's an insurance company out in California, they didn't see it coming, and a raging wildfire fueled by climate change suddenly decimates an entire town of Paradise, California, and they are unable to make their claims, to pay their claims. There are so many of them, and they're suddenly insolvent. That was read about in the Wall Street Journal just the other day, a young investor, 42 years old, and put his whole retirement nest egg into a crypto fund. Thought it was stable and didn't see it coming. Wiped him out completely, starting all over. So this whole notion of not seeing it coming is real. And that's the purpose of these strategic foresight tools. And we're not going to drill down too far in these today, but I would just say that strategic foresight is the way you proactively figure out how to find the future first. It's looking for the patterns that are emerging in what you're seeing. It's listening to what we futurists call signals of change. Quite often that signal of change will be in the form of a question, maybe from a customer. It could be an item in the newspaper, just a little squib in the Wall Street Journal. But it's something that, because you listen to it, you went a different direction. You made a different set of decisions. It could be something like a customer request. It could be something like using a tool, which we have in the innovation arena, believe it or not, to forecast what your customers are going to want before they even realize that they want it. I know that sounds kind of impossible, but there's actually such a tool, and it works. So this whole notion of we didn't see it coming is out there. We've got to deal with it. And make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, there is a cost to not seeing it coming. And we are paying that price right now. We suffered 1 million lives lost to the pandemic because those in charge of keeping us safe fell asleep at the switch. But I know what you're thinking. There were those who did see it coming. Lori Geller, in her 1994 book, The Coming Plague, predicted this situation entirely. Or Bill Gates in 2015, he said in a TED Talk, our biggest threat to humanity in the future will not be a missile, but a microbe. Boy, was he right. So strategic foresight is what we must do a better job of to avoid being blindsided, because that's the nature of the world we're living in. And I see it all the time in the work that I do in the field of innovation. We didn't see it coming. Or maybe it was we saw it coming, but we didn't pay enough attention, right? Blockbuster, BlackBerry, Kodak, I mean, the list of names, and especially as a result of this pandemic, which took out companies like Neiman Marcus and many, many others, they just missed the signal. They were so weak already that when the pandemic came along, it just knocked them under. But they didn't see the trend. They didn't hear the signal. They didn't shift in time. And often it was not the lack of anticipation that took them down, but what they did or didn't do after the wave had washed over them that mattered the most. The name of the game for the next 10 years, ladies and gentlemen, will be adaptation, will be resilience, will be innovation, will be opportunity mindset. Out where I live in California, Santa Barbara, California, we lost 1/3 of all our restaurants. But some restaurants got busy adapting to the new reality. They built outdoor, makeshift seating areas. They emphasized takeout, and today you can't even get a reservation at some of them because demand is off the charts. Now in 2006, Nokia was the #1 cell phone company in all the world. They were growing by leaps and bounds, double digits, and they were rated the 8th most innovative company in the world by Businessweek. What could possibly go wrong? Well, that year, 2006, Nokia invited me to lead a session on driving growth through innovation in Palo Alto, California, for their best and the brightest, their high potential managers, who would be flying in from all over the world for this session, for this symposium. And so I did something for that meeting that I quite often do. I did a brief survey, sent it out by email to all these blokes, and one of the questions was, and what are the barriers to innovation in the Nokia Corporation? Now, I got to tell you, I half expected that they would leave that blank. Hey, we're Nokia Corporation, we don't have barriers to innovation, what do you mean? But instead, I got something like this. Something that, a list that I would expect from a more average company that we might work with. We are risk averse, right? We lack the time to pursue our ideas. We suffer an operational mindset, a short-term focus, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll never forget the session in Palo Alto because I happened to ask the group, about 40 or so managers. I said, if I work for you and I have an idea, what do you want me to do with it? Do I know what to do with it? And one manager sitting right in the middle of the room raised his hand. He said, you know, I would just tell you to forget about it. You're just going to beat your head against the wall in this company. You're never going to get anywhere. Now, admittedly, there were a few gasps in the room that day in Palo Alto, but I got the sense that this gentleman was telling the truth as he saw it. Well, I left that session. I still remember flying home thinking, boy, that was weird, right? That didn't fit with the paradigm. You know, that's not what's being written about Nokia, to find that kind of a culture. And I kind of crossed it off as an anomaly and went on my way. But then 1 year later, Apple introduced the iPhone, and Nokia began their spectacular fall from grace. And later, I thought back on that session in Palo Alto. And I sort of recall these barriers, and I related them to Nokia's fundamental inability to change with the change that confronted them, right? Their inability to navigate in a fundamentally different direction was because of these barriers holding them back. So my question to you is this: who is in charge of busting the barriers of innovation to innovation at your company? Is that you? Is there a person in charge of innovation? You know, I find when companies get into a disrupted state, there are two distinct reactions. Some go into denial, right? It's not that much different than psychological denial. No, I don't have a drinking problem. It's the same thing. And you really can't talk about it. You kind of have to whisper. You know, you're there to be a consultant, but you can't talk about it in the formal meetings. You got to talk about it in the hallway, right? And they're going to hope that it kind of goes away. Maybe it solves itself. Other companies, other leaders, other organizations, completely different attitude. Faced with the very same barrier, the very same market disruption. Maybe it's a regulatory change, an economic, demographic change. You don't know where it's going to come from. But they have a completely different reaction. They're going to give it a big bear hug. They're going to get all over it. They're going to explore it from a very open-minded standpoint. And they're going to figure out a way to turn lemons into lemonade. And that's the difference. It's a mindset difference, and it goes right up to the leadership of that organization. The final aspect of this is what we do with the change that we are being confronted with, right? And I got to tell you, a lot of companies, perhaps like a lot of individuals, are good at making excuses. Of course we're not growing, they will say. There's this and this and this. Or quite often it's, hey, of course we're not growing. We're a commodity. I worked with a call center company, one of the leaders in that industry, working with the top team on innovation. And one of the first things that my host told me when we got there to start that project was, Robert, you got to understand something. I said, what's that? He said, call centers are a commodity. You can't differentiate them. Now, folks, look at how that permeates the thinking of an entire organization. If that's coming from somebody in the top team, and that's the attitude, everybody and their brother in the company is going to adopt that. That's just the way it works. That's just the way it permeates the culture. So what are the cultural rules, if you will, or cultural norms within your organization? Are they hard charging? Are they, we're going to make lemonade out of lemons? Or are they a little different than that, right? But those are the things that we're seeing out there. So one of the things I want to recommend is that we abandon or throw away, if needed, our obsolete models. I heard a fire chief on the nightly news the other night. He said this, I got up, got my pen and pencil, right? You're always working when you're doing what I do. You're always looking for examples, but boy, he just nailed it. And this fire chief was up there in the helicopter, you know, talking to Miguel Algalar, I think his name is, on the NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. And he said, all of our models are out the window. These fires are 2 and 3 times hotter than we've ever experienced before, and they burn more acres once they get started. Well, that's about fires, but it could be about a sort of metaphor for our times. Because the fires are hotter, the fires of disruption are hotter, the fires of having to cope with unforeseen and unexpected kinds of challenges is going to be sort of what is going to confront all of us in the years ahead. And that is not necessarily bad, it's just the nature of how our world of acceleration is taking us. Now, I write a column for Forbes Online, and I recently interviewed an entrepreneur by the name of Rich Sorkin. Now, he is the CEO of Jupiter Intelligence. They're a Silicon Valley company, and they do risk assessment for companies. So what is the real level of threat to your plants, to your data centers, to your business model in some cases? And Rich told me that, for example, he thinks that the insurance industry, with their actuarial models tied to what's happened in the past, being used to predict what will happen in the future, will have to be completely revamped in many cases. So Rich is telling his clients that you need to stop preparing, for example, for just a 100-year flood or a 100-year wildfire or a 100-year storm. You need to think about a 500 or even a 1,000-year disaster, because the unthinkable is now on the nightly news. And that's where we're at, right? By the way, this picture has special meaning to me because that big orange fireball that you see in the bottom of that shot, well, my house is right underneath that. Now, I wasn't there, but my neighbor Alex, who we were all told to evacuate, and Alex didn't evacuate, and he's an amateur photographer, so he went up and down the street taking these pictures, and he said, Robert, if that helicopter had not arrived at that precise moment and dropped water on your house, you would not have had a house to come back to, because it was just that bad. And this was like day 5 or day 6 into it, this conflagration. The governor had called out reinforcements, fire crews and so forth from all over the state, and it was just that hot, just that bad. Anybody been to the Spotswood Winery, St. Helena, California? Well, let me tell you what, they have got a Cabernet Sauvignon there. Now, it's going to run you $90 a bottle, but I submit to you that it is well worth it. And you might want to just pull up a chair there and enjoy the beautiful view, right? But let me tell you something. Beneath the surface at Spotswood, man, it's anything but business as usual. They're waging a quiet battle of their own against the effects of a 1,200-year drought. Yes, you heard it here first. A 1,200-year drought in California, perhaps throughout the West. Soaring temperatures and the smoke of wildfires are having to make them change every aspect of what they do. Here's the way CEO Beth Milligan described it in a recent interview. My parents started this winery, and I'm looking to pass it down to future generations. But to do that, we now have to plan ahead in a way that I never thought I'd have to. But, ladies and gentlemen, notice the determination of that leader. Notice the mindset. Beth and her team at Spotswood are challenging every assumption about how you run a winery, how you grow vines, how you experiment with new varietals. They are navigating the future at Spotswood. They will figure this thing out, and they will be just fine. Now, the next thing I want to talk about with you is your information diet. Now, you just happen to have the luck of the draw here because you've got SBJ in your corner, providing you the best information on this industry, compiling that on a daily, hourly basis for you. And you're very fortunate. Not a lot of industries don't have an SBJ to help them out. But what I want to get with you on is how you're tracking the trends, how you're auditing your information diet, And what are your, what I call frontline observational skills? I mean, it's cumulative and it's interesting, and it's one of the things that in all these interviews with all of these thought leaders, these CEOs, these entrepreneurs and successful people in a wide variety, the number one trait, they have a voracious appetite. They're like vacuum cleaners, just vacuuming up information, vacuuming up data. And they use that to form a superior point of view, a perspective on the future. Nobody has a crystal ball. But if you do that kind of work and you are serious with yourself about what I call auditing your information diet, because you see a lot of you are, sad to say, getting a lot of empty calories. Because there's so many people vying for your eyeballs out there, right? They're pulling you into the trivia and the tweets and all the things that are distracting you from finding that news that you can use. And that kind of news is what just motivates the hell out of you to go out there and change the world. And it's quite often hidden a lot of junk, if you'll pardon the expression. What I say is basically this. You're always looking for the trend. You're always listening for the signal. That's the only way to manage yourself these days, right? Two people will come to a meeting like this, though, not this one, of course. You guys are well beyond that. But, you know, two people might come to a meeting of this sort, and at the end of it, they've gone to the same sessions. They've gone to the same receptions and had the same opportunities for networking. And one person will come out of it and say, you know, same old, didn't get a lot out of that, right? Person beside them is on fire. Look at this idea. We are going to town with this one. And they're just excited, right? What's the difference? It's the way we experience life, the way we go through life. Do we just go through with blinders? Oh, I'll just wait till I get it on the screen here? Or are we going out ourselves and sort of searching for the trends, searching for the news, searching for, whoa, that's interesting. I want to think about that. I want to do a deep dive on that because that could be significant. And it's the difference. It's totally the difference in how we go through life. So anyway, big believer in using history to prepare for the future. Totally using history to prepare for the future. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive. Hey, you thought this guy was a futurist? All he's going to talk about is the years ahead and all the great technology, but no. A great futurist should be a great historian. Churchill said it best when he said, the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you can see. And especially in a time like now, right? You go back to the 14th century, back to the plague of that era, the Black Plague it was called, right? It killed, decimated half the population of Europe. But it also created an opportunity, at least for some people, right? Serfs who had been indentured to the land that they were on, their parents, their previous generations had been tied to the land, but because of the labor shortage, they were able to navigate their future in a different direction. And that's exactly what they did. Think about the inventions that came out of this very dark period, right? The printing press, which allowed, for the first time ever, the transmission of knowledge and ideas over vast distances, and it created a series of revolutions. The scientific, the Industrial Revolution, the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the birth of our democracy here in America. So crises also harbor opportunities if we're ready and willing to accept them. Here's my formula. You see it at the bottom of this slide. Hindsight plus insight equals foresight. So in other words, history, hindsight, your history, peering into your family history, the history, your history of innovation, let's call it, right? Plus insight into the trends, into things that are going on today, gives you that kind of push to be able to have a better perspective, a better insight, and have foresight on the future. I strongly recommend biographies. Yeah, love it. I devour them like candy. And many of the people that I interview are also great fans of biography. But in a world where political polarization, eroding trust, social isolation, and cultural self-centeredness are at an all-time high, biography can serve as a ballast in your boat. It can give you grounding. I mean, how did Eisenhower face the big decisions of his day? What was it really like in those early days when Mark Twain was navigating the Mississippi River as a riverboat captain? And Alexander Hamilton, just a face on a $10 bill, until a guy named Miranda walked into a bookstore in the Miami airport and happened upon Ron Chernow's Feast of a Biography of Hamilton and turned that into the best-selling musical of all time, basically, or the top grossing, I should say. So what we're wrestling with out there, folks, what we're all in on is the fact that we are in a period of exponential change. And it's really the first in humankind. I mean, we've always had change, but it's been gradual. It's been linear. It would get fast, it would, with war or whatever crisis, but then it would slow down. But today, we're in an age of unrelenting exponential change. So it's increasing at an increasing rate. Many of you have heard of Moore's Law. A guy named Gordon Moore, back in 1965, he was one of the founders of Intel, he noticed a trend. He noticed something, that the rate of technological advancement, let's just say, that he was looking at microchips and microprocessors and their capacity, was doubling every 18 to 24 months. That was an example of exponential change. And boy, have we seen a lot of doubling and doubling going on over these last years. And so I think, 6 decades later, we're sort of here. And I think a lot of people are saying, hey, can we maybe go back in time? And I've got to check this out, and I got to say, you can't. But what we can do is shape the future. What we can do is shape the future by our decisions today, by our attitudes today, and by our aptitudes today. As a futurist, I study change, all kinds of change, political, economic, demographic, even epidemiological, geopolitical. And what I notice in looking at the animal kingdom is that, when animals get disoriented, they do all kinds of weird things. I mean, whales will beach themselves. They just climb up there, and there's a little animal in England called the lemming, a little furry animal, right? And when the lemmings get confused, boy, they just rush off the cliff together. And I'll leave it up to your imagination what we humans do when we're faced with this disorienting pace of rapid change. But this is a leadership issue for all of us today, in our families, in our organizations, our companies, in our great industry. And so we need to think about the decisions that we're making vis-a-vis the future. And I'm just going to give you an example. During the pandemic, some families started having meals together again. How many of you, when you were growing up, you had maybe one or two family meals together during the day? I mean, during the year, yeah. Yeah, okay, so most of us, right? But last 3 to 5 years, they went by the wayside. And so some people are bringing them back, right? Tons of research over the years shows that the benefits to kids of doing this are undeniable. They get better grades, they have better vocabularies, less obesity, better mental health. I mean, what can be wrong with that in a period when 1 in 5 kids has seriously considered suicide? Well, I want to head over to Texas, to the ice storm. Any of you involved in that ice storm? Any of you from Texas? Whoa. Okay, so I'm telling you something you already lived, right? But I think most of us, no matter where we live, remember how shocking it was that this kind of thing could have happened in our time. right? How did this happen? I mean, on top of COVID, as if we didn't have enough to deal with, right? And after it was over last year, you know, some people got to looking at that whole question, and some of them remembered, hey, you know, this thing actually did happen before, like 10 years before. We had you all had a very serious ice storm, knocked out power. It wasn't quite as bad, and it didn't last as long. But at that point in time, your Texas Electricity Reliability, I love those words, Electricity Reliability Board, ERCOT for short, they were warned you'd better weatherize your power grid because this is going to happen again. Climate change is coming. Climate change is here. But somehow they just never got around to it, right? And boom, it happened again. Now, I'm not here to cast aspersions on anybody in Texas. But what I am wanting to get with you on is that what happened in Texas is emblematic of how we make decisions in this age of acceleration. We put off and delay. We kick the can down the road. We cross our fingers and hope that we're not in charge when things finally hit the fan, right? And while ERCOT failed to weatherize, the even bigger danger today is that you and I fail to futurize our thinking, our decisions, our perspective, in order to capitalize on the upside and go jet skiing on the blue oceans of tomorrow's opportunity. Futurizing is a navigational skill, ladies and gentlemen. It's as close as your weather app and then wearing a parka. It's Sam Walton flying in his little airplane over a small town in Arkansas to check out where the growth is probably going to occur and putting a Walmart out there on the interstate, on that portion. It's Jeff Bezos exhorting his people to think long term, because when your competitors are thinking short term, you're going to leapfrog right over them. It's every decision you make, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm a big believer, huge believer in futurizing our thinking, and it's very, very simple. All you got to do is every important decision that you make, where is this going to be in 10 years, in 10 years out? And then start preparing for change. So I'm a big believer in visionaries pointing the way to the future, and I want to take my hat off to Elon Musk. However, a lot of people think that Elon Musk is a visionary. I don't, actually. My hat is off to him, however, for being a great inventor, a great entrepreneur, a great innovator. He is a national treasure, despite a quirky personality. I mean, out in California where I live, we greet each other these days with, hey, did you hear the boom this morning? And what that means is that Elon has, through SpaceX, shut off another one of his rockets. And it'll be returning to Earth in about 15 minutes here. And his Tesla company is worth more than 9 of the other automakers combined. He's the wealthiest guy in the world. But carting us off to Mars, I don't think so. Let me tell you about a visionary who I think qualifies as being a visionary, a guy by the name of Bucky Fuller. Now, a lot of people in my generation, I'm a boomer, okay? So, you know, the me generation, right? Anyway, we kind of fell in love with Bucky Fuller. I got to say it that way. Now, he's the guy, you may not recognize the name, but he's the guy that did the geodesic dome. You're familiar with that, right? Bucky, even back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, was already onto this sustainability trend. He was a master at futurizing how things can be done differently, more efficiently, using fewer resources. I mean, he invented this kind of odd-looking vehicle that you see in the middle of that slide there, the Dymaxion car. That thing could turn on a dime. Actually, I guess it could turn over on a dime as well, but that's another matter. The Dymaxion house, which was a factory-built house that he wanted to have it delivered by blimps. All sorts of wonderful things. But Unfortunately, most of his inventions really never got off the ground. The geodesic dome, much celebrated, but the darn things leaked. But it was during a period of his life that, I guess, during a period of setbacks, shall we say, that Bucky did some serious thinking. He came close to committing suicide, the story goes, and he shook himself out of it by asking himself a series of questions. What is my job on the planet? What is it that needs doing? What is it that I know something about that probably won't happen unless I take responsibility for it? And he began to travel the world speaking to students, inviting them to see if there would be a world that would come where we'd need to make a choice, kind of like now, if you would, between utopia or dystopia, right? And he said, folks, we've got to all understand something. There are no passengers on spaceship Earth. There's only crew, and we're all crew. I get a little sad, I get a little depressed when I see quotes like this. It's a good book. It's called Gigged, about the gig economy by a journalist by the name of Sarah Kessler. But she said this, she said, as a young person, you're not allowed to sit out the future. When you see a trend coming down the pike, you know it's going to hit you. And the reason it troubles me greatly is because it reveals a lack of human agency. What we used to call in the old days, get up and go. Make it happen. It's what I call defeatist mode thinking, and it's rampant today. So many people are worried about climate change that they're not having children. They're so worried that it affects their daily life and their ability to function, according to surveys. Half of young Americans believe humanity is doomed. I got so concerned about this, I called up my friend David Lowe. He teaches geology at UCSB. He's one of the leading climate scientists in the world. I said, David, I'm hearing more and more couples are not having children because they're worried about the future climate. And they're not bringing kids into this world. And he told me, he said, I emphatically disagree with that sentiment. And he said, I don't know a single climate scientist in the world who thinks that way. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing about the future is written in stone. There is no problem that is hopeless. There is always room for improvement. There is always a better way. There are always assumptions that need challenging. The future is what we make of it, by our actions and our attitudes and our decisions today. Well, we're almost out of time, and I want to kind of start where we began there with this notion of taking showers. And what we were talking about there, of course, was your idea factory. Now, I happen to know, just hanging out with some of you last night at that reception, that this is a room full of ideators, that this is a group that has a well-functioning idea factory happening, and the kind of ideas that you guys are creating, and that's good. Because I want to just come alongside of you and basically say, or perhaps remind you, if I may, that the road ahead for you will be full of challenges where your ideas will be sorely and woefully needed. Because there will be more and more situations where there are no guidebooks, where there's not a lot of data, where GPS is just not available. And so you're going to need to improvise. You're going to need to experiment. You're going to need to motivate your people that we can do this, we can solve this problem, we can tackle this challenge, and we will be effective. And so that's really my final encouragement to you, is that, you know, wherever you go, if you guard your idea factory, if you nourish your idea factory by coming to conferences like this, by taking what one CEO I interviewed recently calls a Doug Day. He said, I take a Doug Day once a month to just kind of strategize and kind of check in with all the things, but I don't do meetings on that day. I don't do contact with other people. And so my final encouragement to you is that you keep your head in these tumultuous times about you, when sometimes it seems like everyone is losing theirs, right? and push back against those who say that the best days are behind us, that our problems have grown too big. Remember this, the people with the biggest ideas are always going to be ridiculed by people with the smallest minds. So think big anyway. And I'm not suggesting that you accept every change, every technology, every bright, shiny object that comes at you down the pike. Not if it violates your values or is a threat to the common good. Follow the trend? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. That's not my message at all. Be the trend. And if you do some of the things that we've talked about here this morning, you will do exactly that. You know, in my life of travel over the last 30 years, industry to industry, continent to continent, group to group, I have met and worked with a lot of people. And what I see, yes, there are many differences, language, culture, etc. But what I also see is that all over the world, we're similar. I mean, we all want to prosper. We all want to live our best life. We all want someone to love us and to love in return. And we all want to leave the world a better place. We've been through a terrible time in our nation's history, but the future is what we make of it, starting now. So, you've been a great audience. 2 final thoughts, and we are done. Number 1, take a lot of showers, because that's where you're going to fuel your idea factory. And number 2, don't stop thinking about tomorrow, because it'll soon be here. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, let's go. All right.
Give it up one more time for Dr. Tucker. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.